August 1942. The rain fell in sheets across Milne Bay on the eastern tip of Papua New Guinea. Each drop hit the jungle canopy like a tiny drum. The sound was so loud that men had to shout to hear each other speak. The air was thick and hot. Even at night, the temperature stayed above 90 degrees. Mud covered everything. It stuck to boots and made every step feel like walking through wet cement. Captain John Stevenson stood at the edge of the airstrip and looked out at the dark water. He was 32 years old and had been a schoolteacher in Melbourne before the war. Now he commanded 300 Australian infantry soldiers. These men were all that stood between the Japanese invasion force and the most important Allied airbase in the South Pacific. Radio reports had come in 2 hours ago. Japanese ships were moving toward the bay. Intelligence said at least 10,000 troops were on those ships. The math was simple and terrible. 1 Australian soldier for every 33 Japanese troops. The airstrip behind Stevenson held 75 fighter planes and bombers. These planes protected supply lines to Port Moresby. They stopped Japanese ships from reaching Australia. If the Japanese captured this airstrip, they could cut off all Allied forces in New Guinea. They could launch attacks on northern Australia itself. The stakes could not be higher. Every military commander in the Pacific knew that losing Milne Bay meant losing the war in this part of the world. Stevenson had read the same field manuals as every other officer. The rules were clear. Defenders needed at least 3 soldiers for every 1 attacker to hold a position. Some experts said the ratio should be even higher when facing elite troops. The Japanese Marines coming ashore tonight were among the best soldiers in the world. They had conquered Singapore, the Philippines, and half of China. They had never lost a land battle in this war, not once. Meanwhile, Stevenson's men were mostly farmers and factory workers who had finished basic training only 6 months ago. Many had never fired their rifles in combat. The phone in the command post rang at 10:47 p.m. The voice on the other end belonged to General Morris, speaking from Port Moresby, 200 miles away. The general's words were blunt. Allied intelligence had intercepted Japanese communications. The enemy planned to land at 3 points around the bay. They would attack at dawn. They expected to capture the airstrip by noon. Morris told Stevenson to hold out as long as possible. The general did not say how long that might be. Both men knew it would not be very long at all. Morris had already ordered ships to evacuate the planes and essential personnel. He gave Stevenson permission to withdraw his men into the jungle if the situation became hopeless. The general expected it would become hopeless very quickly. Stevenson hung up the phone and walked outside. His boots sank 3 inches into the mud with each step. The rain had not stopped for 5 days. The entire bay had turned into a swamp. Rivers had flooded their banks. Creeks had become rivers. The single dirt road that circled the bay was now underwater in dozens of places. Vehicle movement was nearly impossible. Even walking was exhausting. Men had to pull their legs out of the sucking mud with every step. It took 20 minutes to walk what should have taken 5. The Japanese High Command had studied maps of Milne Bay for months. Their reports described the Australian defenders as weak colonial troops with poor training and low morale. Japanese officers believed Australians would break and run at the first sign of serious combat. This belief came from watching British forces collapse in Malaya and Singapore earlier in the year. The Japanese assumed all English-speaking soldiers were soft and afraid to fight. Their battle plans called for a quick, overwhelming assault. They expected total victory within 24 hours. The plans made no provision for failure because the generals in Tokyo believed failure was impossible. Stevenson gathered his officers in a tent that leaked in 4 places. Water dripped on the map, spread across the table. He pointed to the 3 landing zones the Japanese would use. His finger traced lines showing how enemy troops would advance toward the airstrip. By every rule of warfare, the Australians should retreat now. They should blow up the airstrip and escape into the mountains. They should save themselves to fight another day. That was what the textbook said. That was what every military academy in the world would teach. But Stevenson looked at the map and saw something different. He saw the rain that made movement torture. He saw the mud that swallowed vehicles and exhausted men. He saw the thick jungle that turned every path into a dark maze. He saw swamps where water reached a man's waist. The Japanese were planning to fight the way they always fought. They would move in tight formations. They would rely on superior numbers and firepower. They would attack during daylight when they could coordinate their movements and call in support from ships offshore. Everything about their strategy assumed normal conditions. Everything assumed solid ground and clear sight lines. Stevenson tapped the map where the jungle was thickest. He circled areas where the swamps were deepest. His officers leaned forward. The captain spoke quietly. What if they did not fight the battle the Japanese expected? What if they used the rain and mud and darkness instead of fighting against them? What if they broke every rule in the manual and turned the terrain into their weapon? The other officers looked at each other. No one spoke for several long seconds. Outside, the rain hammered the tent like it would never stop. Somewhere across the dark water, 10,000 Japanese soldiers were preparing to land on beaches they believed would be theirs by morning. Stevenson's plan broke every rule he had learned in officer training. Instead of defending the airstrip in broad daylight, his men would attack at night. Instead of holding fixed positions, they would move constantly through the jungle. Instead of fighting as a single unit, they would break into teams of 10 or 12 soldiers. Each team would know exactly where to hide and when to strike. The Japanese columns would march along predictable paths toward the airstrip. The Australians would hit them from the sides and vanish back into the darkness before the enemy could respond. They would use the rain and mud that made movement so difficult as cover. They would turn the jungle into a maze where numbers meant nothing and confusion meant everything. The technical details were precise. Each ambush team would position itself exactly 50 yards from the main path. This distance gave them clear shots while staying hidden in the thick vegetation. Teams would wait until enemy columns stretched out along the trail. The Japanese always marched in tight groups during daylight, but had to spread out at night to avoid bunching up. When the front of a column reached a marked tree or rock, the Australians would open fire for exactly 30 seconds. Then they would retreat along paths they had scouted during the day. These escape routes led through swamps the Japanese could not cross quickly. Each team carried only ammunition and water. No heavy equipment. No radios that might give away positions. Speed and surprise were the only advantages they had. The first test came on the night of August 26th at 11:15 p.m. A patrol of 40 Japanese Marines landed on the eastern beach. Lieutenant Parker led 12 Australians to a position overlooking the landing site. They waded in water that reached their knees. Mosquitoes swarmed their faces. The men had orders to stay absolutely silent. Parker watched through binoculars as the Japanese soldiers waded ashore. They carried their rifles above their heads to keep them dry. They moved in 2 neat lines toward the tree line. At exactly 50 yards, Parker gave the signal. His men fired 200 rounds in 30 seconds. Then they disappeared into the swamp. When dawn came, Allied scouts counted 22 Japanese bodies on the beach. Not a single Australian had been hit. The ratio was 22-0. General Morris heard about the ambush by radio at 6 a.m. He called Stevenson immediately. His voice was angry. Morris ordered Stevenson to stop these reckless attacks. He said small raids would only anger the Japanese and bring down heavier retaliation. The general reminded Stevenson that his job was to delay the enemy, not provoke them. Morris believed the Australians should prepare defensive positions around the airstrip and make the Japanese pay for every yard of ground. He said night fighting in the jungle was suicide. Soldiers would shoot each other in the confusion. Units would get lost and wander into enemy lines. The general's final words were clear: stick to conventional tactics or face a court-martial when this is over. Stevenson put down the phone and looked at his officers. No one spoke. The rain drummed on the roof. Water dripped through gaps in the ceiling and made puddles on the floor. Then Major Gordon stood up. Gordon was 45 years old and had fought in the First World War. He had seen battles where commanders sent waves of men across open ground to be cut down by machine guns. He had watched good soldiers die because generals followed outdated tactics. Gordon walked to the map and pointed at the coastline. He said Morris was wrong. The Japanese expected Australians to fight like British soldiers at Singapore. They expected a defensive stand followed by quick surrender. If Stevenson's men did what the enemy expected, they would lose. If they kept hitting the Japanese at night and melting away before dawn, they might survive long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Gordon said he would take responsibility if Morris demanded a court-martial. Other officers in the room nodded. They agreed to continue the night ambushes. The main Japanese landing came on August 27th at 2:30 a.m. 7 transport ships anchored in the bay. Barges carried 2,900 troops toward the shore. This was just the first wave. More ships waited offshore with another 7,000 soldiers ready to land once the beachhead was secure. The Japanese plan called for a rapid advance along the coastal road. Their maps showed the airstrip was only 8 miles from the landing zone. Artillery and tanks would come ashore with the second wave. By noon on August 28th, the Rising Sun flag would fly over Allied headquarters. But the road the Japanese expected to use did not exist anymore. 5 days of rain had turned it into a river of mud. Trucks sank to their axles within 100 yards. Tanks could not move at all. The Japanese had no choice but to march on foot through jungle so thick that men could only see 10 feet ahead. They moved in a column that stretched for 2 miles. Front to back, the column took 90 minutes to pass any single point. This gave the Australians dozens of chances to strike. At 4:15 a.m., 3 Australian teams hit the Japanese column simultaneously. One team fired from the north side. Another team fired from the south. The third team blocked the path ahead with fallen trees. The Japanese troops bunched up in confusion. Officers shouted orders that were drowned out by rain and gunfire. Return fire went in every direction. Some Japanese soldiers shot at other Japanese soldiers in the darkness. The ambush lasted 4 minutes. When it ended, 67 Japanese Marines lay dead or wounded. The Australians vanished into swamps that were waist-deep and impossible to pursue through. Allied casualties were 3 men with minor wounds. By dawn on August 27th, the Japanese had advanced only 2 miles. Their original plan said they should have covered 6 miles by this time. They had lost 128 men in 3 separate ambushes. Every attack came from a different direction. Every time they tried to pursue the Australians, the enemy disappeared. The jungle seemed full of ghosts who could see in the dark and move through water like fish. For the first time in the Pacific War, Japanese officers started to question their intelligence reports. These Australians were not weak colonial troops. They were something else entirely. By August 29th, the numbers told a story that military experts would have called impossible 3 days earlier. The Japanese had landed 10,000 troops with tanks, artillery, and naval support. They had pushed forward against 300 Australian defenders who had only rifles and light machine guns. Yet the Japanese had advanced just 4 miles in 72 hours. They had lost 342 men killed and another 180 wounded. Australian casualties stood at 19 killed and 31 wounded. The ratio was stunning. For every Australian who fell, more than 15 Japanese soldiers died. This had never happened before in the Pacific War. In every previous battle, Japanese forces had crushed their enemies with minimal losses. The success of Stevenson's tactics reached Allied commanders across New Guinea. General Morris, who had threatened court-martial just 2 days earlier, now ordered every available unit to Milne Bay. By August 30th, another 1,200 Australian soldiers had arrived. These reinforcements did not dig defensive trenches around the airstrip. Instead, they broke into small teams and learned the night ambush techniques. Veterans from the original 300 showed the new men how to move silently through waist-deep swamps. They taught them to pick firing positions exactly 50 yards from paths. They explained how to shoot for 30 seconds and then vanish before the enemy could respond. The entire Allied force became a ghost army that struck without warning and disappeared without trace. The Japanese tried everything to counter these tactics. On August 31st, they launched their first daylight assault with 600 troops supported by 3 tanks. They believed overwhelming force in broad daylight would finally break through. The attack began at 10:00 a.m. The tanks rumbled forward along the muddy road. Infantry followed in tight formation. This was how the Japanese had conquered half of Asia. But the road was so torn up from rain that the tanks could only move at walking speed. Australian machine gun teams had positioned themselves in the jungle on both sides of the path. When the tanks reached a narrow section where the road passed between 2 swamps, the Australians opened fire. The infantry could not spread out because mud and water blocked every side path. They bunched together behind the tanks and became easy targets. The battle lasted 40 minutes. All 3 tanks got stuck in mud holes. The Japanese lost 187 men. The Australians lost 4. The attack collapsed. Japanese commanders held an emergency meeting that night. Officers stood in a tent lit by oil lamps. Maps covered the table. Rain hammered the canvas roof so hard that men had to lean close to hear each other speak. Major Hayashi, who commanded the Marine Landing Force, argued for a new strategy. He wanted to move troops inland, away from the coastal swamps. He wanted to attack through the mountains, where the ground was firmer and visibility was better. But Colonel Kawada, the overall commander, refused. Kawada had orders from Tokyo. Those orders said to advance along the coast and capture the airstrip as quickly as possible. Changing the plan would mean admitting the original strategy had failed. Kawada said the problem was not the strategy. The problem was that his men were not trying hard enough. He ordered another assault for September 2nd. Meanwhile, Australian soldiers adapted their methods even further. They began using the jungle sounds to mask their movements. When rain fell hardest, they moved into new positions because the noise covered the sound of boots sucking through mud. They learned that Japanese troops always stopped to rest between 2 kakgm and 4 handgm. This was when the Australians struck most often. They discovered that Japanese officers carried maps with detailed notes about troop positions and supply routes. Every ambush team had orders to search bodies for documents. These captured papers gave the Australians perfect intelligence about enemy plans. By September the 1st, Stevenson knew where the Japanese would attack before they attacked. The vivid reality of fighting at Milne Bay was unlike anything soldiers on either side had experienced. The rain never stopped for more than an hour. Men fought while standing in water. Their clothes stayed wet for days. Skin turned white and wrinkled. Boots rotted and fell apart. Jungle rot infected cuts and scrapes. Simple wounds became serious in the heat and moisture. The smell of decay hung over everything. Dead bodies swelled in the tropical heat. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds, so thick that soldiers breathed them in. At night, the darkness was absolute. Men could not see their hands in front of their faces. every sound became magnified. A breaking branch might be an enemy soldier or just a tree limb falling. The snap of a twig could mean death was 10 feet away. Soldiers learned to navigate by touch and memory. They counted steps to know how far they had gone. They felt tree trunks to stay oriented. Fighting in these conditions required a different kind of courage than standing in an open field under fire. A captured Japanese document from September 3rd revealed what officers were reporting back to Tokyo. The report said Australian forces were using tactics that made conventional military responses ineffective. It described the Australians as highly skilled jungle fighters who knew the terrain perfectly. It noted that their night ambush methods caused confusion and fear among Japanese troops. Most shocking were the final lines. The report stated that continuing the offensive would result in the complete destruction of Japanese forces at Milne Bay. It recommended immediate withdrawal. This was the first time in the entire Pacific War that Japanese commanders asked permission to retreat from a land battle. Tokyo refused to authorize withdrawal. High Command ordered the attacks to continue. They sent a message saying that Japanese Marines had never retreated and would not start now. On September 4th, Kuwata launched his final assault. He committed every soldier he had left. The attack came at dawn with 1,400 troops advancing in 3 columns. By noon, the assault had failed. By 3 p.m., Japanese forces were in full retreat back toward their landing beaches. By nightfall, they were loading survivors onto transport ships. Australian forces had not just defended Milne Bay, they had won. They had driven an enemy army back into the sea. The final statistics were stunning. The Japanese landed 10,000 troops over 8 days. They evacuated 7,318 survivors on September 7th. They left behind 2,682 dead or missing. They abandoned all their tanks, most of their artillery, and tons of supplies. Australian casualties totaled 161 killed and 212 wounded. The defenders had been outnumbered 33-1 when the battle started, yet they had inflicted 18 times more casualties than they suffered. No defensive battle in modern warfare had ever achieved such a lopsided result. The implications were clear. Japanese troops were not invincible. They could be beaten, and they could be beaten badly. The Japanese High Command met in Tokyo on September 15th, 1942. Senior officers gathered in a room with tall windows overlooking the Imperial Palace. These men had planned every Japanese victory since Pearl Harbor. They had conquered territory from China to the Philippines to Burma. They had never discussed a defeat because they had never experienced one on land. Now they faced reports from Milne Bay that seemed impossible to believe. One general read aloud from Colonel Kuwata's final dispatch. The words were carefully chosen, but the meaning was clear. Kuwata wrote that Australian forces had fought with skill and determination that exceeded all expectations. He stated that their tactics were superior to Japanese methods in jungle terrain. He admitted that continuing the battle would have resulted in total annihilation of Japanese forces. Another document lay on the table. This one came from captured intelligence officers who had interrogated wounded Australian prisoners. The report described how a force of only 300 men had held off the initial assault. It detailed the night ambush tactics and the way Australians used terrain as a weapon. The final paragraph contained a statement that no Japanese military report had ever included before. It said that Australian troops had demonstrated combat effectiveness that equaled or surpassed Japanese Marines in jungle warfare. This admission sent shockwaves through the command structure. For months, Japanese propaganda had told the public that their soldiers were naturally superior fighters. Now their own generals were saying that Australians had beaten them at their own game. The immediate impact reached every Japanese unit fighting in the Pacific. On September 20th, new tactical guidelines went out to all commanders. The guidelines warned that Allied forces could not be underestimated. They stated that night operations required special precautions. They recommended avoiding narrow paths through heavy jungle. They advised keeping tight control over troop movements and maintaining constant communication between units. These were all lessons learned from the disaster at Milne Bay. Within weeks, Japanese forces across New Guinea changed how they fought. They stopped assuming quick victories. They prepared for determined resistance. They respected their enemy in ways they had not before. Allied forces studied what happened at Milne Bay even more carefully. Military analysts from Australia, America, and Britain interviewed every soldier who had fought there. They examined Stevenson's tactics in detail. They measured the results against traditional military doctrine. The conclusion was revolutionary. Small mobile units using terrain and darkness could defeat larger conventional forces in jungle conditions. This insight transformed how the Allies fought for the rest of the war. By November 1942, American forces training for jungle combat learned the Milne Bay methods. British troops preparing for Burma studied the same tactics. Australian units made night ambushes and swift movement through difficult terrain their standard approach. The Ghost Army techniques that Stevenson invented in Desperation became the foundation for jungle warfare doctrine used by every Allied nation. Captain John Stevenson received the Distinguished Service Order in October 1942. The medal ceremony took place in Port Moresby, with General Morris pinning the decoration to Stevenson's chest. Morris made a speech about courage and leadership. He did not mention that he had threatened Stevenson with court-martial just 6 weeks earlier. Stevenson was promoted to major and given command of a full battalion. He fought in 7 more campaigns before the war ended. He survived them all. In 1945, he returned to Melbourne and went back to teaching. He never spoke much about Milne Bay. When students asked about his medals, he said he had been lucky to serve with good men. He died in 1978 at age 68. His obituary in the Melbourne newspaper mentioned his teaching career and his family. It included one line about his military service at Milne Bay. Most people who read the obituary had never heard of the battle, but military historians never forgot. Milne Bay became required study at every major war college in the world. West Point taught it. Sandhurst taught it. The Australian Defence Force Academy made it the centrepiece of their jungle warfare course. The lessons extended far beyond jungle fighting. Milne Bay proved that smaller forces with superior knowledge of terrain could defeat larger armies with better equipment. It showed that unconventional tactics often worked better than following the rule book. It demonstrated that the side willing to adapt and innovate had enormous advantages over enemies who relied on past successes. These principles applied to every type of conflict. The broader implications reached beyond military strategy into how humans solve impossible problems. Stevenson faced a situation where every expert said defeat was certain. The numbers were overwhelming. The conventional wisdom was clear. Yet he looked at the same facts and saw different possibilities. He understood that rules exist to guide normal situations, but sometimes normal situations require abnormal solutions. He trusted his own judgment even when superiors threatened punishment for breaking protocol. This pattern repeats throughout history whenever people overcome seemingly impossible odds. It happened when doctors discovered that washing hands could prevent disease even though scientific authorities said germs did not exist. It happened when engineers built bridges using methods that textbooks said would fail. It happened when activists changed unjust laws that everyone claimed could never be changed. The connection to modern challenges is direct and obvious. Today's problems often seem overwhelming. Climate change affects the entire planet. Poverty traps billions of people. Diseases spread faster than cures can be found. Technology creates new threats as quickly as it solves old ones. Experts look at these challenges and see the numbers. They calculate the resources required and compare them to what we have available. Often, the math suggests failure is certain, but Milne Bay teaches that numbers do not tell the whole story. 300 soldiers should not have defeated 10,000. The fact that they did means we need to think differently about what is possible. Every impossible problem contains hidden advantages if we look hard enough. Every overwhelming challenge has weak points if we study them carefully. The question is whether we have the courage to try unconventional solutions when conventional wisdom says they will not work. What happened at Milne Bay in August 1942 matters because it reveals something fundamental about human nature. We are not limited by the resources we have. We are limited by our imagination and our willingness to take risks. Stevenson and his men succeeded because they refused to accept that defeat was inevitable. They looked at rain and mud that made fighting miserable and realized these same conditions hurt the enemy even more. They turned their greatest disadvantage into their greatest weapon. This kind of thinking changes the world. It wins battles that should be lost. It solves problems that should be impossible. It reminds us that the person who sees possibilities where others see only obstacles often determines the future. The Japanese High Command learned this lesson the hard way when they admitted that Australians had taught them something they thought they already knew everything about. Sometimes the teacher becomes the student, and sometimes 300 determined people can change history.